They had a logic to how they moved. They didn't like to go into the very low marshy spots because they would get stuck. And they didn't like to go to the really high spots in the mountains because weather was so unstable. So they stuck to the foothills, and that became a network of trails because they were all so heavy. But when I would imagine herds of them, thousands of 1,000-pound animals running over a landscape, I would imagine that the water table under the ground would experience this kind of drumming, this profound drumming that would enliven the bottom crust of the earth that spreads all over the place. And that life force must have enriched and enlivened the root systems of the prairie grasses that grew so strong in that area. And yet the sharp hoofs of the buffaloes as they run would create holes and divots which would reseed and receive the seed again from these prairie grasses. And so I think that often when we think about infrastructure, we don't always think about the holistic idea of what the sound of migrating buffalo must have been to the entire ecozone of massive parts of the North American continent. So this is a complicated idea, and a lot of the readings last week are also very like kind of head-based. And I think that when we think about sound, one of the wonderful things about sound is it often opens up our intelligence that is more intuitive, and we receive it in a more holistic kind of way than just our brains. And that's the kind of work that Farm Lab at Metabolic Studio has been exploring with sound, is not so much sound as music, but sound as agency to shift stagnated, like interconnected networks of the web of life that have been fractured and broken so they can't kind of flow. So before we move on, I wanted to at least kind of make sure that the basic ideas that we've been through in the first 2 weeks of earth repair and then sound as infrastructure kind of get a moment to seep in. So Doug, would you like to take over for a minute and maybe reconnect? Some of you came last night to Metabolic Studios Learning and Mending, but we thought we would share again some of Doug's thoughts on Douglas's thoughts on sound and infrastructure in relationship to our work together.
Absolutely. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, I mean, if you weren't here last week or last night, my name is Douglas Leigh. I've been working with Lauren now for a number of years on various sonic projects. I'm not sure I'll be able to do quite as good of a job as you just did in stating how sound relates directly to the studio practice. But I can certainly talk about some of the concepts of soundscapes and these ideas of soundscape, as an infrastructure in and of itself. I mean, some of the basic concepts. I'm kind of going over my notes here as we do this, but let's see. Pardon me. I'm just reviewing right now. Yeah, I mean, well, basically, soundscapes as infrastructure is quite a radical concept that I don't think gets properly recognized in most institutions. I mean, the idea being is that for millions of years, insects, birds, mammals, all had an established soundscape, and some of these soundscapes evolved just like the creatures themselves evolved. And so you can have these soundscapes in the Amazon where the insects are chirping at a specific high frequency and the mammals are murmuring around in some of the lower frequencies, and maybe the birds are tweeting in the mids, and maybe even like the ultrasonic stuff that we as humans don't hear. But what they've created is a symbiosis of sound together as a unified structure, so that when the insects sing, the birds can sing and the mammals can sing, because they're all in different frequency bands that have evolved for hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, I suppose, depending on the species. um, and of course, when human beings come into the situation, it was, obviously is, incredibly destructive to these soundscapes. And everything from, the most obvious example is planes flying overhead. We hear them all the time, and they're incredibly disruptive. It's just a blast of white noise across the entire frequency spectrum. Nobody can hear anything. And some of these species, like we referenced last week, there was we talked about a species of toad in Mono Lake that choruses together in unison. Thousands of frogs chorusing together in unison, and then when the planes fly over, you can actually hear this chorusing dissipate, because now the frogs can't hear each other anymore, and it takes them quite a long time, maybe an hour, to get that chorusing back in the rhythm that it was in. And the chorusing, of course, when it works, enables predators to not be able to find them, right? So the predators just think that there's that, it's one giant frog spread out over this whole lake. But then when it gets disrupted, that the predators can clearly hear where the individual species are, and boop, come in and just snag a meal. Here we go. The coyotes and the birds and everything can just flock right in. And that's a very tangible example of how a human-made soundscape can actually just totally physically disrupt an environment and cause harm to that environment. Not just, oh, it's not pleasant to listen to, but we're having species that are being picked off by predators because their camouflage, as it were, their sonic camouflage, has been disrupted. Um, and that's just the things we know about, right? I mean, we don't even understand really how we understand mating calls, and we understand communication somewhat between animals, but we certainly aren't uh, we aren't the grasshopper hearing the chirp, right? We don't truly understand what these things mean. So when we disrupt these biomes and we disrupt these sonic biomes with and I mean, you name it, whether it's, a highway, traveling right through a forest where, you think, oh, okay, well, we've got a road, we've got a forest, the trees are still there, people can still drive through, everything's great. But in reality, everything is not great, because none of the animals will go anywhere near that road, which means, and because of the traffic sounds or whatnot. And therefore this disrupts their mating. This disrupts their community, and so I think looking at sound and specifically animal sonics, biophonies, as it's referred to, um, can be, well, nobody can speak for them, right? They can't speak for themselves, and they don't speak English, so they don't like no, or they don't speak any human language. So we just don't understand exactly what we're doing, but we can see measurable disruption to these biologic communities. Um, and so I think some of these ideas are pretty radical in and of themselves, just because I don't think that most people recognize that a bird song should have the same agency as a three-story concrete building, right? Like, so why can it, if we have a bird singing in a tree, why is it not allowed the same agency and the same infrastructure that humans are? I mean, kind of know the answer to that. Kind of comes back to they don't have anybody lobbying on their behalf to the human race. So we make these wild assumptions about what exactly we are and aren't doing to these ecosystems, but I think a lot of those assumptions are wrong. Um, and I mean, there's a huge body of evidence to show for it. There's a number of artists. If anybody's interested in learning more about it, there's a number of artists working in this field. Most notably, Bernie Krause. He's been working now as a soundscape ecologist. He was a hipster musician in the '60s in San Francisco. And then just got totally turned on to the sounds of nature, and then began using his well, what he would do is he'd basically just go out and record endless field recordings of exact locations in his area, wherever it may be, Sierra Nevada mountains, Muir Woods, and then doing things like, okay, going in and recording one meadow every year over and over again, same location, same place for 20 years. So now we've got a measure of how much different biophonic sound was in these places 20 years ago up until today. And so this is one way that I think a lot of people are trying to at least do something to try and mitigate the effects, or at least bring attention to this disruption of soundscapes, is by just creating these massive archival libraries of sound, which we at the Metabolic Studio are also doing a little bit, well, quite a bit actually. We have a silo in the desert, and that's been recording sound 24 hours a day we're coming on to 10 years now. So we even have, and there's obviously many different sounds happening at this location. It's abandoned factory, so there's owls that have taken over, there's coyotes that come through, there's endless birds and insects, and all of these species vocalize. And now we've got an archive of 10 years, 24 hours a day, night and day, of their vocalizations. And this can be used amongst other libraries that other people have in different areas to try and at least measure the health of an ecosystem with sound.
So Douglas, can I interrupt a sec?
Of course, I hope
Okay,
I'm not.
no, I could listen to you. I could listen to you forever. It's like listening to jazz. I love how you popcorn in your own brain, and it's all brilliant and wonderful. I wanted to bring up the silo because last week I started the class with a video of the Owens Dry Lake, and that was one of the things that I thought I needed to pull back a minute this week and describe. I don't know how many of you know that the Metabolic Studio's intention is to manifest a vibration or an aliveness, a sense of aliveness in the artificial watershed of the LA Aqueduct watershed. That is a 240-mile stretch of canals, siphons, and channels that move the snow melt from the Eastern Sierra through that network out to sea. And it was established at the same time as the Panama Canal by the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, which was manifesting the idea of manifest destiny. And the principle of that is that if the United States wanted to compete with imperial countries in Europe, that it needed to control international trade, since there wasn't royalty in the United States. So this effort to build an aqueduct was an effort to control the Pacific Ocean through having specifically Los Angeles and San Francisco be ports that would control trade with Asia. And that had been an ambition since the first European colonizers came to the East Coast and attempted to build an internal link between the East Coast and the West Coast through the Erie Canal. So the basic principle of colonization was organized around world dominion through economic trade and capitalism. And the tools by which colonization attempted to build this infrastructure was dredging, and the labor force was the mule. So that George Washington made his fortune by importing mules from Europe in order to create the infrastructure for global trade. So just to kind of, again, come back to this idea of the bison, what's missing in our narrative about kind of sound is the reparation work of what trying to reshape a continent in order to build a capitalist empire around extractive industry did to reshaping the entire continent around that ambition. So one of the ways that Metabolic Studio has tried to consider this reparation work is to look at this one cyborgian watershed that we in Los Angeles live by, which is the LA Aqueduct watershed, and to think what the role of sound can be in beginning to repair Payahunadu. Payahunadu is the Paiute name for a place where there will always be water. So the deep irony of the desertified high glacial lakes around what's today called Owens Valley is that the foothills of the Sierra were a paradise. They were a paradise of a network of cascading glacial lakes that stretched all the way from the Sierra to the Rocky Mountains. So once upon a time, there was an inland sea that filled that entire area we call the Great Basin. And the Owens Lake is just one of the last remaining giant lakes of what would have been an internal ocean. And that lake would have had migrating birds and grizzly bears and all kinds of other birds and insects and deer. It had people, the Paiute people, who had lived in harmony, not as the principal at the peak of a pyramid, but in harmony with the grizzly bear that was way more respected and empowered than human beings at booting the food chain. The Paiute people have the oldest known irrigation systems and the oldest known agricultural systems on the continent, if not the world. And it's not really studied by people. They moved water from the mountains to alternate fields to grow grains millions of years ago. I think it's more than 2 million years ago. So the LA Aqueduct was a strategy to reshape the continent in this idealized form of global empire. But it was one that was very short-sighted, and we're seeing the end game of that right now because we haven't figured out how to mitigate entropy. If you take and take and take from the earth, from the fruit of the earth without enough giving back, things get out of balance. You have heat and no cooling. So in a very symbolic way, what we've done at Metabolic Studio is to begin to try and repair conceptually the damage done on the Owens Lake by taking a silo and a network of silos that exist on the edge of the dry lake and stretching one single cable up and down the 100-foot by 30-foot diameter steel silo that vibrates when the wind moves by. And that vibration is connected underground by a cable that stretches down into a spring that's about a mile into the middle of the lake. And that string vibrates, and when the silo moves, it starts to shape sand berms, which begin to hold rainwater and create spaces where cattle range. So the logic of that is that as long as the silo stands, which is steel, and as long as the wind blows, which is probably going to be for a very long time, then there is agency that the sound will have for creating a new logic of place. So that's what I've been working on with Douglas, and I wanted to see if I can re-show you a video just of that single string so that you can see that, because I think last week I jumped too quickly into showing you the whole lake and a very strong sound of wind, which can actually be quite unsettling. And some of the feedback I got from some people was that they're very sensitive to sound, and the sound of the wind and the sound moving through those silos, instead of bringing them energetically into being centered, scattered them even before the class started. So I wanted to do a little repair work of the intention of that. So if you hang in with me, I'm going to try and play this for you. Let's see. By screen share and share sound. Can you see that picture so far? Yeah. Okay.
This one is fading before the others, but again,
Actually, you might be onto something.
kind of like move here. Let's call it a day.
Yeah.
And we have the second pair of the thing. Just massive.
So again, I hope that it sort of shows you some of our studio practice with sound, where we're exploring the analog aspects of how sound as vibration can be stimulate a sense of spatial wholeness. So those tuning forks rely on a mallet to hit them in order to transmit sound directionally where you want that sound to go. But the silos, the thing that replaces the mallet is the wind. The wind moving through those strings agitates those strings and creates sound wave where we have shown you in the video, which is in a central space, which then takes it to the ground and out from the ground. So the idea of being able to use sound in the kind of Kabbalistic way, you know, that in the beginning was the word, and the word is the unknowable. Naming breath, it takes breath to make a word. And in the beginning, there was something like vibration. And from that vibration, all matter, vibrant matter, begins to cohere, is the basic idea of what we're working with in Metabolic Studio. And we're using that theory in a lot of research-based practice to find out whether we can organize biologic remediation using sound, whether we can run the same kind of strings through the pipes we're running in the LA aqueduct, so that wind that moves on our site agitates the water as it moves through those pipes before it even gets picked up and cleansed. And I bring this up to you with the same homework assignment where we introduced the idea of a tornado clean, to talk about the concept of putting all your energy for a short period of time into the cleanup of space. And I wanted to make that bridge with the idea of using sound as a way to set a directional intention towards cleanup. So does anybody have any questions? It's a complicated thing to try and teach. So first of all, is any of this making sense? Because I've never tried to teach about sound as infrastructure before. So I just wanted to get some feedback about whether this is making sense and whether the videos and the conversation is adhering. Okay. Thank you, Amy. Does anybody have any questions about it? And I just wondered, I don't know, Tina, if you would be willing to talk about sound practice and your experience, because I've experienced a ceremony with you where you use sound in a very strong way to move energy. And I'm wondering if you would be willing to share with the class any of your own practice of sound work. She might not be there.
Yeah, I wonder if we lost her in the mountains.
Does anybody else, Doug, do you have anything more that you want to add about that? You want to talk about SoundBridge or any of the analog? You know, one of the things that you and Marti taught me a lot about, because again, so much of the sound and sound practices that we hear about in the art world are electronic stimulation or based in transmission art, you know, the way that radio signals work or satellite signals work. But the actual idea of the physics of sound as wave is I think something that is very interesting, because it is about creating something that applies energy to a system, which then sets a wave into motion, which can be reflected. So there's parts of sound that can be brought in to the idea of a post-human infrastructure conversation where something goes into a system, creates energy, and that energy gets reflected. And sound is just one of those examples. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, sure, sure, absolutely. One of the things that I think is a particularly interesting about, we had two different videos. So I'll start with the second one with the tuning forks, which we've called Sound Bridge. That was an experiment designed to connect our two sites with sound. We have a site on the east bank of the Los Angeles River and the west bank of the Los Angeles River. And there's a distance covering somewhere about, we measured it, it was around 300 feet, I think, as the crow flies. And so we were trying to design an instrument with, it was me and Marti Ruiz. Marti Ruiz, is the gentleman in the video, is an acoustics and sound sculpture researcher and professor from the University of Barcelona, who's done a few artist residencies with us and helped us explore these phenomena. What's very interesting about those tuning forks and their directionality, and that you don't really get in the video, is how far that sound can stretch. And so we did go from the west bank to the east bank easily with those tuning forks of a distance of 300 feet. And any of you who are musicians who play acoustic instruments probably know that that's not super easy to play your instrument and go 300 feet. I don't know how far that is, like quarter of a mile or something. Maybe not quite that, but so I think that was one of the real fascinating things about that research. Marti is particularly fixated with tuning forks, and so this was his first opportunity to scale up some of his research, because he was doing it on a smaller level where the forks are maybe this big to this big. We have one that's it's about 2 feet tall, so massive. It rings for over 2 minutes. So I think that would, in terms of just acoustic phenomena, something that's very particularly interesting about that exact sonic technology. And and then the other thing I thought was interesting that I just wanted to comment on was the video beforehand with the single string. That's Aeolian harp technology. Aeolian harps have been around since it's one of the earliest instruments, actually. I mean, obviously drums are earlier, but it goes back to thousands of years. And an Aeolian harp is basically a string that is set into motion by the wind. And the sound you heard in the video was the sound of the string resonating with the silo. The silo is not amplifying the sound in any way whatsoever. It's just simply conducting the sound through and into the air. So there is no trickery in that sense. And what's particularly fascinating about an Aeolian harp phenomena is that let's say when you play a guitar and you hit the strings, you are striking them in a transversal manner, right? So you're plucking the string is going up and down this way, and that is producing the tone of. And then you can also activate a string latitudinally, right? So basically, if you take that same string and now you make it, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet long, and activate it this way, you actually send the sound wave up and down the length of the string this way, right? So a guitar is moving, the waves are moving through the string this way, and through a long stringed instrument, which an Aeolian harp is, it is moving from top to bottom of the string. And so what makes Aeolian harps different from both of these is that it is actually activating the string both latitudinally and longitudinally. And what that creates is multiple frequencies in one string. There's no other acoustic method used, string-based acoustic sounding methods that can actually produce multiple tones over one single string other than Aeolian phenomena, where the string is being activated at both its latitudinal axis and its longitudinal axis. So I think that's a very interesting consideration. Anyhow, that I always like to point out, oh, the Aeolian harps, no, you don't understand. They're super cool. I think I would just throw that out there and leave that there. Unless somebody had questions. Oh, you're muted, Lauren.
I put the link in the chat bar to the radio transmission of that analog sound. And it's interesting because that's what I played last week, and it can be upsetting when my daughter was a schoolgirl and I would play it at home. She would say, "Turn that off, it makes me anxious," right? And I used to think that was like insulting until I realized that it isn't a composition. It's a in a way, it's a diagnostic, right? It tells you about a condition of the environment that is a stimulation, and it's an interesting way to think about how we can hack ruins into becoming agents of transformation. We don't know what the transformation will be, but we do know that the site is transformed when you're there by the acoustical presence of the environment as registered through that installation. So I bring that up as we start to begin to encourage you in this week, moving into next week, to start to think about a site that could receive some kind of post-human infrastructural project that you would feel you could deliver to it. So I wanted to show that to you because, again, making art outside of a box, like 240 miles away from an art center, the question comes up, who's going to hear it? So the whole idea of, well, let's make a website that plays the sound, but then that sound is not pleasant. It's not like Tibetan bells or gongs where people meditate by it. It's like you might be in a good mood and play it and go, oh my God, turn it off. So how do you transmit the art intention and who's it for? So this whole idea of like putting together post-human infrastructural projects does bring up the question of who's it for. And so that radio a priori mapping program that we posted last week is a place where Doug has placed all of our sound work experiments in the area of the Owens Dry Lake. And again, one of the practices we have is the belief that bearing witness to places that have been compromised by infrastructural systems that deplete one environment so that another one can thrive. Since we live in that place where we thrive because of the removal of water from one to another, our practice is one where we think, well, sometimes maybe it's important to just go ahead and make these things, because being present and putting energy into that system is a way of mitigating that machine, that capitalist manifest destiny machine that's so rooted to the experience of colonization that many of us are a part of. So another thing that we've done together that I wanted to briefly show before we move on to discuss our tornado clean was the idea of bearing witness by taking sound recordings. I wanted to share with you one more video of Doug on site on the Owens Dry Lake, making a sound recording map, which all of these recordings you'd hear if you go to radio a priori and put in the Owens Dry Lake, but somehow with the visuals embedded, it takes you somewhere else. So one more little video, share sound is here. So I think that now kind of maybe gives a fuller picture of the homework Go Get Lost, and to think about what the soundscape is a part of, because what you saw there was Doug's sound work with the studio from the very top of the High Sierra to the glacial lake that's been stripped of its water, to Los Angeles, and a sound bridge over the LA River, being a 240-mile soundscape of a cyborgian watershed that is pretty much impossible to talk about as a body of work, but as a research-based practice in the infrastructure of sound. I thought maybe this would help and maybe inspire some of you in thinking about the work that you're doing for this, for yourself and for this class and for the environments that you're living with. So thank you for receiving that. And I wanted to open it up to Millie now to talk a little bit about her her work with Doug and with Leigh in using sound as one of Farm Lab's tools in creating a field of energy or potentiality around the brownfields that we're working on both sides of the LA River. And Leigh, feel free to chime in.
Absolutely. Great evening, everyone. Welcome back. It's always great to see everyone here. The first thing that comes to mind is how we're currently, or we have in the past, grown gourds in a brownfield. And for those of you that don't know what a brownfield is, it is a contaminated site that the government has labeled a toxic site. So as you all aware, we are currently undertaking a grassroots bioremediation case study on both sites. And on one site, we have successfully lowered the lead content by 7%. Now, knowing that that we've lowered the lead content, we have been able to safely grow specific vegetables. One that is not considered a vegetable, but it is in the vegetable kind of family, is a gourd. And the gourd, and I bring this up because Leigh Adams, my colleague in Farm Lab, is considered in our at the studio as the gourd queen. And so she has worked many, many years growing corns and gourds. And I should have had one with me, but we can grow gourds that are about this big. I mean, we're talking about what, 2 to 3 feet wide and 2 to maybe 2 feet high. And Leigh has in the past has created instruments in collaboration with Doug. And so if you guys can imagine, we cleanse the soil, we grow these amazing, beautiful gourds that are just hanging off of these trellises that we used to have on the land. And then you bring Doug and Leigh together to start brainstorming on how to use these gourds as water instruments. It is a beautiful collaboration, I do have to say. So the other thing that they're currently doing is that they are having we're actually going to have a discussion hopefully this week on how currently the LA Zoo is using sound. They're doing some kind of research with sound, and maybe Leigh, you can elaborate because you know the story a little bit more than I do.
Yes. So it's very exciting that the LA Zoo is now currently studying bird migration patterns and how they are affected by sound and what has changed. And I'm very excited about learning more about that. And we have access to that, which is really exciting. So the things that open up in the space of metabolic are amazing. There's a drone at the moon. There are frogs singing in the studio, outside the studio. And in each place, what that does is it cleans the space. It clears the space for new and original thought to occur and different ways that we can try things. We're encouraged to try and to cross-pollinate one another in the things that we do. It is so exciting. Each time I enter that space, I feel energy burbling up in me because I know there's something new I can try, someone new I can talk to, someone old I can talk to about new things that have occurred. And that synergy is extraordinary. And it's on both sites. It is in all the spaces. And it's something really, really exciting. Now, the gourds are the oldest cultivated non-food crop on the planet. And historically, they were grown in Chinatown, where the studio is. So it's very nice to see them back there again and creating community space. And then that community space gathering under the shade and shelter of those gourds. And then our ideas cross-pollinating and going, what can we do with this? How can we do this? Did you know these are used to hold water? They're used to hold seed. They're grown worldwide and they belong in virtually every culture. And yet we lost touch with that because of our dependence upon plastics. So looking at organic materials coming back into play, reusing the things that we grow. The vines from the gourds make great insect housing. The seeds that's our next crops, and we have an abundance that we can share with people so that others can participate in that same one sense of wonder. And we have a new crop growing now, and looking forward to what we're going to do with it and how we're going to do it.
And so I did miss introducing you, Leigh, and I would love to introduce you briefly to the rest of the class. Leigh Adams has been working with the Metabolic Studio and directly with Farm Lab for many, many years. And I've always admired and have always been inspired by her way of sharing her knowledge. And it humbles me when she asks me to teach her something, because I always feel that she's my mentor and my teacher. And I consider her a plant, animal, and water whisperer because she has a very beautiful frequency. Anytime anyone sees her, she has like this joyful smile on her, and she's always very welcoming. So thank you for being with us tonight, Leigh. And before we go into the reading, I believe we're going to take a 5 or 10 minute break, Lauren. But before we do, I'd love to go over the guiding questions for tonight before we go into the reading. I will summarize briefly what we will be reading tonight. So the delightful beaver, which we'll be reading tonight, is the original water engineers. And is taken from Erica Geis's Water Always Wins. And this is what the book looks like. Thriving in an age of droughts and deluge. It reintroduces us to our forgotten eco-engineers, those underrated rodents. I don't consider it a rodent. Castor fiber and Castor canadensis, also known as beavers. These enchanting creatures have so many attributes that it behooves us to study and learn from them. Note that we've lost by eliminating them and strive to reintroduce them and live alongside them. The water mantra, thanks to Brad Lancaster. I'm not sure if anybody knows the author Brad Lancaster. I highly recommend his books. His mantra is slow it down, spread it out, and infiltrate. It describes the exact actions of beavers since millennia before humankind arrived. Beavers are the avatars of the slow water movement, and it's time they return to their natural habitats. So tonight's guiding questions. Number 1, beavers in family groupings live in harmony with living systems. What influences compel them to do what they do? 2, the restoration of living systems thrives in the presence of beavers. How are those benefits measured in benefits to the environment rather than as achievements of human goals? And lastly, how can we educate the public as to the advantages of these programs and get lands dedicated to the beavers? Tireless and ongoing work. So I believe Mary, thank you so much, Mary, has typed them up onto our chat just for us to review towards the end of the reading. And now back to you, Lauren.
So I'm going to begin our break by reading a poem that will hopefully allow you to use this break to ground yourself in this full moon ascendancy. And it's a poem that Leigh has suggested. It's called Water as a Sense of Place um, from this idea of water always wins. The water I used to drink spent time inside a pitched basket. It adopted the internal shape, took on the taste of pine, and changed me forever. I remember carrying that basket from the pump, the slow swell of the damp roots, sway of a walk that made carrying it easier. Sometimes I imagine steps forward, both in and out of flood, Tar Creek, Spring River, in and out of baskets. Graham's hands, long, smooth fingers, powerful and exact, pull and twist, sorting spokes and splitting weavers, constructing my idea of water. 2. I forget to ask for the name of the creek that used to run through what is now my backyard. They piped it under, but with enough rain, it remembers where to go. Returns to shift mud and retaining walls. It is, I imagine, referred to somewhere downtown by the number of its pipe. 3. Early training holds fast. I sleep with water to the east of me, wake humming or singing and go to water. Bareheaded in all but the most violent rainstorms, a connection I cannot give up. My hair and lashes glittering at first, then weighed down. I throw my windows open to the rain and lean out into the shock of contact. Water so thick in the air, all but my closest neighbors are erased. Rain is not an emergency, not in October, not in this place. I take it in breath by breath. This is from When the Light of the World Was Subdued, and the author is Kim Shook, Cherokee, born in San Francisco and belongs to the Northern California Cherokee diaspora. She earned her BA in art and MFA in textiles from San Francisco State University and is the author of several books of poetry, including Smuggling, Cherokee, and Deer Trails. She's known for her award-winning weaving and beadwork and is the recipient of the 2019 National Laureate Fellowship and is the 7th Poet Laureate of San Francisco. So grab a glass of water or a quick shower. It's 5 o'clock and I would suggest 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock or wherever everybody is o'clock. It's 5 o'clock in Los Angeles. Why don't we meet back in 10 minutes? I'm going to go stick my feet in water. It's also in my genetic DNA, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. So I'm also fasting today. So if I'm a little bit lightheaded, I'm going to actually have a drink of water to make me more clear-headed for this reading. So see everybody in 10 minutes. Everybody back? From your swim, psychic swim? So again, here we are in week 3, and what we're looking at is the human, animal, and geological creation. This is a reading that's been selected for Farm Lab by Leigh Adams. I wanted to say that Leigh is a magician. She is a very, very magical human being that transforms every place that she touches. And we're very fortunate to have her participate in Metabolic Studios Farm Lab for so many years. But she also is like a fantastic pollinator. She's pretty much sharing for fun and for free her knowledge of the web of life with as many people as she can reach. And I don't know, but I think this might be the first time somebody's asked her to select a reading. Is that true? So, we're all teachers here on this, in this space, and none of us are experts, and we're all kind of trying to be inspired generalists that give back to the web of life. So it's really important to talk about, this being a kind of first effort for us at Farm Lab to take our on-the-ground practice and kind of pick the fruit from that tree in a general way and to find written word that connects to it. So I wanted to introduce that before Millie introduced the reading today. Are you going to read the section? Were you going to read the section about the week 3 reading?
The week 3 reading, we already did that before.
Okay. All right. So then I will just screen share after sharing one other thing that I wanted to say about gourds, which is that basically they're the first means by which people carried, or one of the first means by which people carried water. They're light and durable, and really a smart thing to be growing for for many reasons, because you can collect seeds from them and grow more. So they also have the ability to reproduce. But if you're living in a hot, arid place, they also provide a lot of shade for the soil, which helps a lot to connect a lot of dots about how to cultivate things in arid environments. And one of the things that I'm hoping that connects for you is to next week's visitor to this class, which is Farm Lab's Alex Tanasi, who will be sharing with us some readings that he's found on the tradition of making clay pots and gleaning clay from the earth, and that whole practice of turning the earth into water retentive vessels that we can hold water in. So the connection between these infrastructures is water, which connects to the reading about beavers and water management. So within these infrastructures, people have grown gourds for seeds, for water, for art making. There's a whole collection of gourds that people have shaped. You can form the shapes you want in gourds by making molds, by binding them. You can etch into gourds, almost like tattoo them. So they've been traded and shared as very special objects, and are understood around the world, I think, as such. So I just wanted to say I'm very thankful that Leigh brought gourds and the concept of gourds to the Metabolic Studio, and we've been delighting in them and growing them as part of the Three Sisters template of corn, bean, and gourds, because gourds and squashes and pumpkins are part of the same family. Is that right, Leigh? You're muted.
Absolutely. They're cucurbits.
I wonder if you could just share briefly that story about Japan and gourds, because it's a wonderful anecdote. I think, do you remember Roxanne had put a gourd on a table and you walked by and you said, I brought that seed to Japan.
Yeah, to China.
Oh, to China.
Roxanne had done a dance program in China. And soon after I first came to the studio, and when she returned from China, she came back with a couple of small gourds that are called Nigerian hard-shelled gourds. When the Chinese government had invited me to China to teach them about our US ways of using gourds and African ways of using gourds, I had taken those little tiny North African, they're called Nigerian hard-shelled gourds, and I took them to China, where they were elated because they could grow 2 crops a year and have these little miniature gourds that wouldn't take up too much space in their small homes. So I actually had introduced the seed of those gourds to China about 10 years before that Roxanne went, maybe not that long, and they were growing them and selling them, and she came back with them. It was a magical moment. Yes.
And I bring that up to also just talk about the idea of co-creative practice and the mysteries that happen when you work in a co-creative space. Roxanne introduced the tornado clean, for example, that I put in your homework that we'll discuss also later today, as a way to think about reparation work, starting from your own relationship to your own space and how that impacts your body and your surroundings, because her primary practice is as a dancer. So you can learn these things in mysterious kinds of ways, and the idea that a seed is so portable and so strong, you know, that you can carry it to whole other continents, and then find these connections years later is very fascinating, especially as artists are trying to commit to ways of making art with a lower footprint on a carbon footprint on the planet. The idea of growing gourds in wonderful sculptural shapes, or drawing them, or traveling with a seed that you plant and work with, is also an interesting thing to think about. They're also very light. So gourd art is something that I think is a very old tradition that is fun to say is very much alive and well at Metabolic Studio, and I'm sure other places in the world. And Doug has been working, as Millie said, with the gourds, making a kind of gamelan-like tonal piece out of them. So having said that, let's jump into this week's reading from Water Always Wins. And as is the tradition of our class, we'll put the text up, and people, let's just take it in turn to read it. When you have read enough, stop, and someone else, please jump in.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect.
I'll start. Excerpts from Water Always Wins. Beavers, the original water engineers. Guerrilla gardening is the rebellious act of secretly sowing plants on blighted land to restore ecological function and beauty. In Southwest England, someone has taken this concept to the next level. guerrilla beavering. Around 2008, Eurasian beavers, castor fiber, popped up on the River Otter in East Devon. Aside from beavers not being the river's eponymous semi-aquatic mammal, who also lives on the River Otter, their presence surprised locals because the rodents have been absent from the British Isles for at least 4 centuries, hunted into local extinction by desire for their soft fur, meat, and pungent glands used for medicine and perfume. Just outside of Cookworthy, a small rural town, we pull into a parking lot of a dark, rambling building that serves as the office for Devon Wildlife Trust. Wetland ecologist Mark Elliott greets us with a slightly nervous elbow tap as COVID-19 has just been discovered in England. Over the last several years, Elliott and other wildlife ecologists in the United Kingdom have imported beavers from mainland Europe to populate licensed studies. But those beavers were deployed in fenced-in areas. The ones in the River Otter are living wild. Elliott, who is running one of the controlled studies as project manager of Devon Wildlife Trust's beaver work, doesn't believe the otter beavers are escapees. I think people are deliberately releasing beavers, he tells me.
But why wield a furry orange-toothed rodent as your stream repair tool of choice, as people are now doing in both the United Kingdom and the United States? Beavers dig canals and build dams to create pools of deeper waters so they can peruse a wider area for food and building materials with safety from land predators. Their engineering works rehabilitate stream health and function by creating areas of slow water. In the United Kingdom, people are planting beavers to help protect towns against a rise of flooding. In the western United States, people are using North American beavers, Castor canadensis, to help protect against drought and even wildfire. Beavers mean higher water tables and water on landscape throughout the dry and wet seasons, says my friend and Canadian journalist Frances Backhouse, author of the compelling 2015 book, Once They Were Hats, In Search of the Mighty Beaver. Other animals also played important roles in shaping the landscape for water when there were more of them and fewer of us. Bison dug or expanded wallows to mud their skin for protection from flies. The pocks they left behind acted as groundwater recharge ponds across the landscape. Prairie dog burrows provided pathways for water to move underground when the landscape was too hard to absorb rainfall efficiently. On the extremely flat surface of southern Florida, where alligators have made a remarkable comeback from near extinction, the reptiles' nests elevate spots by a few feet, ultimately creating small hills called hummocks on which less water-tolerant plants can live. But along with humans, beavers are the most significant water engineers on the planet. Backhouse draws another, less flattering parallel between humans and beavers. We're both control freaks, yet we have very different ideas of the best way to shape water. That goes some way toward explaining why human dams sicken waterways and beaver dams restore them to health. The shortest answer is that other species evolved with beavers' interventions. Our massive engineering came about suddenly on the scale of evolutionary time. Also, beaver dams are smaller and somewhat porous. Water does move through them, just at a slower rate than it would otherwise. And although water moves through human dams too, a lot of it is released on a different schedule and velocity than nature prefers. When beaver dams might seem too small to make a difference, as with other slow water approaches, multiple small interventions across a landscape add up to a big impact. Beaver enthusiasts, hydrologists, biologists, and ecologists who call each other beaver believers are doing some detective work to measure the ecosystem benefits and water services beavers provide and to determine good places to release them.
Beaver down. To understand how beavers' handiwork can have such powerful effects, it helps to think about what these landscapes looked like before people killed most of them, when beavers and water had an intricate, important relationship. Prior to Europeans' arrival in North America, an estimated 60 million to 400 million beavers lived on the continent, occupying nearly every headwaters stream. As nature's original slow water engineers, beavers shaped North America with their dams, creating a much wetter continent than the one we know today, spreading and slowing water wherever they went. Their ponds covered more than 300,000 square miles, turning 1/10 of the continent into rich, ecologically diverse wetlands that supported numerous other species. Textbook behavior of ecological engineers. The longest documented beaver dam found via satellite in northern Alberta measures 2,790 feet, twice the length of Hoover Dam. Many indigenous peoples across North America hunted beavers too, but they typically regulated their harvests with beliefs of interdependence among species and recognition of the spirit of non-human beings. Together, these values constrained their take, according to once they were hats. Some groups even viewed beaver as kin, as part of their clan. Then, 500 years ago, the nature of this relationship changed dramatically as foreign economic incentives and technology rewrote the rules of engagement. After European fur traders arrived, beaver numbers plunged to less than 1% of their historical population by 1900. This was no accident. In the mid-1800s, Hudson's Bay Company ordered its trappers to hunt out all beavers in the Northwest, creating a fur desert that would elbow out competing companies. Beaver numbers across North America dropped to as few as 100,000, according to Ben Goldfarb, author of the charming book Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. The animal's decimation fundamentally altered the plumbing of much of North America. With beavers and their dams, water moved to the ocean more quickly, scouring stream beds, deepening their channels, and reducing slow phases and spaces where surface water could recharge aquifers. Groundwater levels fell. The North American landscape became a drier, less ecologically diverse place.
Across the big pond in the United Kingdom, people had lived alongside giant beavers since the Stone Age. Later, humans shared space with the modern Eurasian beaver. Both humans and beavers retreated to the south with the advent of various ice ages, and both returned after the last glacial maximum, about 9,500 BCE. As the climate warmed, what was once tundra became mixed forest, and later woodland, a partially open blend of trees and shrubs. During this period, wetland plants and animals adapted to rely on the habitat beavers created. Elliot tells me on my visit to Devon, consider willows, he says, which coppice resprout in response to beavers chewing them. You get a change in the canopy structure because the beavers are cutting down the bigger trees, and you're getting this lovely fresh regrowth of younger stuff. As the beavers are moving around, the vegetation is changing in response to what they're doing. But people were also interested in woody plants and began clearing forests to farm as far back as the Neolithic period, about 4,300 BCE. Fast forward to the start of the industrial age when logging rampant to build ships and fuel steam engines. Around the same time, Britons hunted the last of the native beavers.
The lowlands were already prone to flooding during big winter storms. Removing trees and beavers exacerbated the problem, and in recent years, climate change and development have made it worse still. UK Meteorological Office records stretching back to 1862 show that 6 of the 10 wettest years have occurred since 1998. In just the last few years, the UK has seen damaging floods in Cumbria, Yorkshire's Calder Valley, South Wales, and Shropshire. Even under a low impact climate change scenario, flooding is predicted to increase in 85% of UK cities with a river, including London. Under a high impact scenario, some cities and towns could see the quantity of water per flood double. After beavers were exterminated, or nearly so, in the United Kingdom and North America, humans exacerbated damage to streams and rivers, as in Seattle, by speeding water off the land even faster. They straightened waterways, meanders, and even moved them by digging new channels to better conform with property lines. Add to this the hard grazing by cows and sheep that rips out grass from the roots, plus the animals' tendency to stand next to waterways for hours, tamping down the soil, and you end up with thoroughly ill streams.
The absence of beavers from the landscape over several generations of humans means that people today are accustomed to a landscape devoid of beavers, and in fact, larger animals generally. It's the shifting baselines phenomenon again. The idea of coexisting with other animals, relinquishing space to them, weighing their needs as equal to our own, is largely anathema to the dominant culture in which human supremacy goes largely unquestioned. We also seem to be uncomfortable with change. Beaver's handiwork restores a more natural landscape, but many people think their tonic looks messy. Trees felled across creeds, piles of sticks forming dams that look a lot like slash piles from clear-cut logging. But the neat straight channels we built are ailing systems. Beavers built roughness, as ecologists call it, makes possible slow water and all its benefits. The logs and detritus that Mike and Natural Systems Design placed carefully across Thornton Creek in Seattle are an imitation of beaver's work, a mimicry that Miwok people in California made earlier to slow water on steep slopes, infiltrate it underground, and create wet microhabitats.
The same pursuit of slow water that inspired the Thornton Creek restoration crew is also luring beaver believers across the US West. They are hoping to reap these benefits for local water storage, a goal more important than ever as snowpack and glaciers are, for the most part, not capturing the quantity of winter water they did in years past. Beaver dams slow water, and sediment drops out of the flow and begins to raise the stream bottom. Eventually, water can access the floodplain again and disperse across the landscape, slowing it further, reducing scouring, erosion, and flash floods. Then microbes have time to break down pollution, and water can infiltrate underground for storage.
In the United Kingdom, people are looking to beavers to protect against increasing big floods. Beaver dams slow water rushing down streams for heavy rains. Scientists call this attenuating the peak flow. It's similar to the principle of flattening the curve during the coronavirus pandemic. By quarantining, society slowed the spread of the virus, reducing the peak numbers of people hospitalized, ideally to a level healthcare workers could handle. Because beaver dams are somewhat porous, much of the water detained will ultimately flow down the river. Some evaporates from the pond, some percolates down into the groundwater system, and may rejoin the river later, further downstream. The net result is that water travels downstream over a longer period, reducing the possibility of a huge wave that overflows banks and floods towns. In 2011, Elliot and his colleagues kicked off this site by introducing a couple descended from Bavarian beavers. This project was authorized by Natural England, a conservation arm of the national government. There are now multiple fence trials across the country, including those in North Yorkshire, Cornwall, Essex, Somerset, Gloucestershire, Cumbria, Norfolk, West Sussex, and Dorset. Here on the West Devon site, beavers now number 5, and they have constructed 13 dams, creating 13 ponds across their territory between 2011 and 2016. In slowing the water and spreading it laterally from the original stream, they have expanded the wetland area from about 1,000 square feet to 20,000 square feet. Together, the ponds hold up to 264,100 gallons of additional water above the ground. Since then, the beavers have not built additional ponds, but they continue to adjust the height and width of their dams, and the volume of water on the site continues to rise. Anecdotally, the landowner, John Morgan, has told the researchers that the road immediately downstream of the site used to flood regularly during heavy rain, but hasn't done so since the beavers were introduced. The water stored on site also helps sustain the stream during dry spells. Summer 2016 drought and stream flow coming to the complex completely dried up, yet water continued to flow out, keeping the stream below viable.
Eventually, we cross the River Otter and arrive at Otterden Mill, where a water wheel has been churning for 1,000 years. Today, the wheel still grinds flour and serves as the centerpiece for a cafe, restaurant, art center. The mill sits at one end of Otterden, a tiny old English village with just a few streets. Here we meet one of Elliot's colleagues, Jake Chant, field officer of the River Otter Beaver Trial. A sinewy guy with a wide smile and a fast patter, he's perpetually available for beaver emergencies. His out-of-the-office automated email response offers this: if you need urgent support with beaver management, please call me on ... The River Otter Beaver Trial Study, published by the University of Exeter, found the beavers' expanding numbers and engineering activities have had positive benefits for wildlife, fish, ecotourism, and cleaning pollution from water. And the 13 dams at Elliot's West Devon site and the 6 dams on the River Otter upstream of the village of East Budleigh significantly reduced peak flood flows. During storms, peak flows were 30% lower on average, leaving the sites than they were without beaver dams. 30% lower on average, leaving the sites than they were without beaver dams. These effects were true even in saturated midwinter conditions. Follow-up research confirms similar results across multiple beaver sites in England. Even during large storms, beaver dams still reduced flooding. In fact, at the West Devon site during Storm Frank in December 2015, dams had even more impact. Outflow was 3 times lower than inflow. In 2020, the government decided the River Otter's gorilla beavers could stay, concluding, the 5-year trial has brought a wealth of benefits to the local area and ecology, including enhancing the environment at a local wildlife site, creating a wetland habitat, and reducing flood risk for housing downstream. They will now be allowed to remain there permanently and continue to expand their range naturally, finding new areas to settle as they need.
Devon Wildlife Trust was elated, saying in a statement, "This was a landmark decision and one of the most important moments in England's conservation history. It was the first legally sanctioned reintroduction of an extinct native mammal to England." Meanwhile, gorilla beavering continues. Beyond the river otter, other populations of free-living beavers were spotted on rivers in Kent, North Somerset, and Wales. As of the time of this writing, Natural England is planning a strategy for managing wild beavers and potential further releases into the wildlife across England.
Today, beaver reintroductions are increasing in popularity around Europe. UK restorationists were inspired by work in Bavaria, Germany. Scotland has also been reintroducing beavers, officially welcoming them back in 2016 after several centuries' absence and awarding them legal protection in 2019. There, the animals are living wild in Knapdale Forest in Argyll and along the River Tay. Eurasian beavers, including those in the UK, are now estimated to number 1.2 million across the continent. Beaver believers in the Western United States have also been an inspiration to the Brits, even though the Americans are primarily interested in enlisting the critters to fix the opposite problem, drought.
Unlike in the United Kingdom, where beavers are so scarce that restorationists must import them from Europe, in North America, the animals managed to hold on after the human assault. Today, their numbers are growing, although no federal agency systemically surveys the animal. Author Goldfarb says biologists estimate there are about 15 million beavers in North America today. Unfortunately, as they return to their homelands, they often run into trouble. During their centuries of near absence, another animal moved into their preferred habitat, us. Where a truce between the two species remains elusive, biologists catch the beavers, as Alves and Bailey are doing this day, and relocate them into more remote terrain where their skills can be put to good use. California's busy beavers are being transplanted, sometimes by parachute, to mountain areas where their industry and skill will benefit the state. These beavers are live trapped by the Department of Fish and Game in farm areas where they can damage crops and levees. You can see a little beaver on a parachute. Bailey live traps are harmless. Beaver dams in the mountains save water for fish, wildlife, and agriculture. Although many beavers have paid with their lives for crossing human desires, wildlife managers in the Western United States began relocating problem beavers as far back as the 1920s to take advantage of their skills repairing watersheds. In a 1050 paper in the Journal of Wildlife Management, Elmo W. Heater with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game wrote that beavers do much toward improving the habitats of game, fish, and waterfowl, and perform important service in watershed conservation. However, beaver redeployment was somewhat limited in Idaho at the time by a lack of roads into the backcountry. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game came up with a solution inspired by World War II airborne divisions, parachuting beavers into the wilderness. Wildlife managers built a crate designed to deconstruct upon landing. After experiments with dummy weights, they enlisted as their test subject an older male beaver, whom we fondly named Geronimo, writes Heater. They dropped him again and again to make sure the system worked. Each time he scrambled out of the box, someone was on hand to pick him up. Poor fellow. He finally became resigned, and as soon as we approached him, would crawl back into his box, ready to go aloft again. Or maybe he enjoyed the view from the sky or the thrill of the jump. The researchers decided that Geronimo deserved just reward for his service. You may be sure that Geronimo had priority reservation on the first ship into the hinterland, and that 3 young females went with him, writes Heater. Even there, he stayed in the box for a long time after his harem was busy inspecting the new surroundings. However, his colony was later reported as very well established. In fall 1948, the researchers dropped 76 beavers in the Idaho mountains, suffering just 1 casualty, a beaver who managed to get out of the crate while it was still in the air.
The California Division of Fish and Game, later renamed California Department of Fish and Wildlife, had also been deploying beavers as watershed engineers. Between 1923 and 1950, the staff distributed 1,221 beavers into watersheds across the state. California Fish and Game biologist Donald Trapp explained why in a 1942 report. It is now understood that soil erosion and shortage of water in some places resulted from the destruction of the beavers which formerly built and kept in repair dams on the upper reaches of many streams. California wildlife staff, inspired by their Idaho colleagues, deployed the last of these beavers by parachute to El Dorado National Forest between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe. A poster from 1950 shows a cute line drawing of a beaver, sans crate, parachuting into a wilderness scene with mountains, stream, deer, and other beavers building a dam. The caption explains that California's busy beavers are being relocated from farm areas to mountains to save water for fish, wildlife, and agriculture. Beaver Jedi mind tricks. Despite this history, many people's first instincts when facing a problem beaver today is to kill it. A U.S. federal agency euphemistically called Wildlife Services claims its mission is to resolve wildlife conflicts to allow people and wildlife to coexist. In practice, though, wildlife often ceases to exist. The agency reported killing nearly 26,000 beavers in 43 states during 2020. Private citizens are also allowed to kill beavers on their property. Yet killing them is only a temporary fix in most cases. Removing beavers just opens up prime beaver habitat for the next family that comes across it, Al says. We always tell landowners that trapping is a short-term solution to a long-term problem. If you have beavers now, you're going to have beavers again.
Because of this persistence, beaver believers such as Alves first try to create detente between people and beavers in place. Beavers and humans are both territorial, yet if people and beavers can come to an understanding over water management, they can live peacefully as neighbors for years until the beavers run out of food or their pond silts up. Originally, this area was a giant beaver complex. When farmers moved in, they drained the remaining wetlands and moved the stream uphill to the edge of a farm field, which caused regular flooding. That's part of why this area was selected for salmon habitats restoration. To solve the problem too, the restoration has made extra space for slow water, which has reduced flooding overall. But the beavers' work also ended up flooding the edge of an adjacent landowner's field. That's when the government agencies called Beavers Northwest to help keep both beavers and people happy. The beavers were relocated. Just 6 years ago, this land was still an open farm field cut by a straight channelized drainage ditch, banks denuded. The human restorers reintroduced curves into the stream and created backwater ponds for slow water. They planted thousands of willows along the banks and alders behind and dropped logs across the channel to simulate a natural system where trees fall across the stream. To the beavers, it suddenly looked quite homey.
At
At
various,
various points. Oh, go ahead.
go ahead. Nikki, it's yours.
At various points along the creek, Kara and her crew have installed the pond levelers, black corrugated plastic pipes lying just under the water. They prevent flooding by allowing water to pass through dams or other beaver-created obstacles, partially draining the pond, reducing its water level and, therefore, nearby flooding. The tricky part is if beavers hear the sound of running water, they'll plug the hole. To avoid this, the outlet of the pipe needs to be underwater where it won't make sound. That can be challenging because water levels naturally fluctuate with the seasons. In some cases, beaver believers build an impenetrable cage around the outlet, and frustrated beavers eventually come to accept that they won't be able to stop the sound. This site has a couple of cylindrical cages around the ends of the pipes. Working with these animals never becomes rote, though. Beavers are individuals, all with different temperaments and proclivities. Like people, they are problem solvers and highly adaptable to different situations. Once they learn how to overcome something like a human intervention, they'll replicate it every single time and teach their young. Beavers continually surprise the people who work with them. Although their classic needs are trees and water, they've been found living in grasslands or tundra and even in a dry ditch. In open agricultural areas without lot of vegetation, Dittbrenner has seen them build dams with canary grass they dig up from root wads. To pack it, they mine the must from just above the dam because that's the slowest moving water and the mud is settling. So it's this replenishing mud supply. He explains their technique. They swim down and grab some mud and hold it on their chest as they swim up, and then they walk up on their feet with their tail like a little support so they don't fall backwards, and then they'll pack it into the dam. Dittbrenner and Kerr show me one of the larger dams beavers build on this stream. On the surface of the pond they've created, sunlight dances on the filamentous swirls of pollen. When working with their preferred media, wood, beavers are expert crafters, says Dittbrenner. When you pull a dam apart, it's just amazingly interwoven. They don't just throw a bunch of sticks together, they're sliding them in and then they do another one and they slide it in, and as it gets pushed down, it just kind of naturally weaves itself. Later, walking back to the car, we cross a small section of open meadow. Although we choose a path through the grass about 30 feet from the creek, the land is boggy. The beavers have created this high water table, the groundwater pushing toward the surface. It's a habitat zone that humans have eradicated in many places. More than a third of endangered or threatened species in the United States rely on wetlands, and riverside corridors of vegetation are particularly valuable for species migrating to adapt to climate change. Fortunately, when beavers recreate this habitat, there are enough wetlands remaining that the area tends to be quickly recolonized by their native species, says Dittbrenner. There's a pretty rapid inoculation of life from wetland to wetland. Alvis has seen the phenomenon too. Her crew with the Tulip tribes has set up game cameras near potential beaver introduction sites and tracked just a few squirrels in a whole year, she tells me. After reintroducing beavers, 2 years down the road, we have bobcat and bear and cougar and otters and salmon returning to some of these sites.
Drought busting power. One of the main goals for beaver reintroduction in the Western United States is to heal sickened streams, thereby increasing the amount of slow water on the land and underground. The science demonstrating the benefits of beavers' hydrological work is young, but an active field of research. Researchers in 2015 found that the average beaver pond contains 1.1 million gallons of water and stores another 6.7 million gallons of water underground. Beaver water complexes can even act as a fire break against the mega fires that climate chaos is wreaking here. And given that desiccated plants are volatile tinder for fires, it's possible that a widespread return of beavers could help reduce fires, both by keeping plants better watered and by providing more local evaporations from the ponds and transpiration from plants to fuel local rain. And that's our introduction to beavers, our original engineers.
I just love that reading so much, Leigh. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I wanted to, but while we're still on to the beavers and the West, I wanted to share a little video that Leigh has brought a practice to the studio, which is very beaver related, which is what we call the building of Googles, right? Where she's trained us to swim around ponds and gnaw at pieces of wood and carry it back to old parking lots in our hands. And then with our tails, we bang out the asphalt of a parking lot and collectively dig with our paws, and then assemble the wood and the debris from all around us to create essentially arid land beaver bogs that we call hugel mounds. So just to kind of connect the dots for a kind of action that we're taking that connects to tornado cleans, I'm going to screen share one more video for you. Hold on. Screen share, share sound.
Hugel culture is a practice of creating a mound, the word Hugel in German, and culture, which we all know. So Hugel culture is mound culture. So we have built from the ground up, layering logs, green waste, manure, and other nitrogen-rich and carbon-rich materials. And as those mature and ripen in place, we have a fertile growing space. Because it's built on the banks of the LA River, the historic banks of the river, it's submerged. It's covered over with floodplain, which is one of our experiments. So when we think about hugel culture, my first introduction to it was through fallen trees and noticing that things grow not where the tree fell from, but where it fell to. So the tree is giving something back.
So I thought that was a good example for you of us kind of embodying the beaver practice in a new form for the arid lands. And hopefully that will segue into this next part of the class, which is about this idea of tornado clean. And that is, what are we capable of? Like, what can we do? And so what you're seeing in that video is a team of 7 of us taking apart a parking lot and basically building a way to hold water in the ground so that we can catalyze a water retentive landscape that will support a self-generating, self-diversifying habitat, or a novel urban mini ecosystem. So, you know, as we go into our breakout rooms right now, what I'd really like for you to do is to sort of hybridize the intelligence of the beaver, the embodied intelligence of the beaver, with the several weeks now where we've talked about where are you living? What are you drawn to? What is the acousmatic environment that you're living in? And how did the tornado clean experience affect you? This is a way to start to have a little bit of an open studio conversation about the potentiality of a 1-month project that you could perhaps realize yourself or realize with a group of colleagues around you. But before we even get to defining a project, I thought sort of thinking about, you know, what we can do through thinking about what we've been able to do, emulating the beaver with Leigh's guidance, you know, because there is a strong visual connection, I think, between the Hoogle Mound and the beaver work. So I thought it was very interesting that Leigh selected this to read. Am I reading too far between the lines, or would you agree?
Not at all. I think that hugel culture is a natural phenomenon that occurs in creeks when they flood. And it seemed a natural thing for us to try for bioremediation. And if we had beavers, I'd work with them. I don't think you're stretching too far at all. I think that I have heroes and not all of them are human.
Great.
May I say something really quick? I was really inspired by that connection, Lauren. And in fact, I would love to do an experiment with a hugel and cleansing water. How cool would that be? Like just that notion that beavers can do that and also create an ecosystem. That's just so
Absolutely. Well, I think that that's definitely something that we're thinking about with bending the river, which is that when we bring the water out from the LA River, wouldn't it be good if we could build a kind of hugel mound cleansing system, which would catalyze a new kind of novel urban ecosystem, as well as cleanse the water. We're certainly seeing that in the portable wetlands, but we haven't yet done it on a landscape level. So, want to read the other questions besides the ones that I've just thrown out, Millie?
All right, guiding questions. Number one, beavers in family groupings live in harmony with living systems. What influences compel them to do what they do? Two, the restoration of living systems thrives in the presence of beavers. How are those benefits measured in benefits to the environment rather than as achievements of human goals? Three, how can we educate the public as to the advantages of these programs and get lands dedicated to beavers' tireless and ongoing work?
Question 4, how can we emulate the teamwork that we see with beavers in our own environments? Question 5, how does the notion of cleaning your own personal space and how it makes you feel extend to what you might be able to do in 1 month in your own environment? Just get the juices flowing. This will be a 10-minute breakout room, and then we'll reconnect for another conversation. Oh, I will leave you with another sort of floating question. What is the difference between growing and making? All right.
So our group gets to choose a question, right? Because there are a lot of questions there, right?
Yeah, they're just meant as like a amuse-bouche, you know what I mean? There's where these are tantalizing thoughts to send you off with. You can talk about whatever you want, but they're just meant to be sort of teasers for your group to approach in any which way you want. So how did that go? Anyone, anybody
great.
want, anybody
That
want
was
to share
juicy.
at all? Yeah.
Well,
Concept-
Mary Rose just did a great job saying how we had sort of circular energy in the conversation, which I thought was exquisite and lovely. And I just want to note that now I'm used to the breakout room, and we actually said goodbye and thank you before we got thrown like down the flume of Zoom. So that felt really nice to not feel like we got like not through anybody's fault, but just shocked back to the room. So I really appreciated everyone's thoughts. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We got a moment to talk about the culture of metabolic, which encourages us to explore and experiment without an expectation of success, and that mistakes are what we learn from as well as successes. And that's such a rare commodity. I really appreciate it enormously.
We got to talk about the idea of the beavers and nature in general, like expecting life to go in cycles versus humans thinking that everything is permanent and can always stay the same and kind of be sealed off.
Yeah.
It's pretty nice.
I also have a piece of beaver wood if anyone wants to see it.
Yes,
I did not steal it from an active dam, but I did harvest it from a discard pile. So, and you can actually see some of the little teeth marks there from them grinding down their teeth, like Alexandra was teaching us in our breakout room.
Thanks for sharing that. That's really special, especially for those of us that live in an urban environment and don't really get to see the beaver. That's really cool.
And we started to broach the subject of what beavers make, you know, is there's a nice analogy with some of us here who make objects, right? But that they're making things in harmony with the world that they live in. So this idea of what you make and what you grow are connected. So, you know, the idea of time is also really clear because it takes so much time for a forest to grow. And then a beaver, the beaver's work ends one process and begins another. And that decay and that sludge becomes a living system, a murky pile from which other things kind of arise. And it brings up, you know, the beginning of this part of the class where I feel like now we've been through 3 weeks of thinking about post-human infrastructure in relationship to art practice. And I thought, you know, for next week, it would be great to open up with each of you talking a little bit about what you're making, you know, not necessarily everything you're making, but what are you making and where is the start of what you make? Like, where does it come from? What is it made out of? And how do you know when it's complete? That's one of the things that I find really interesting about the making and growing aspect. You know, if you grow something and then a beaver comes and knocks it down, is it complete then? Or is it now just you know, when I think about metabolic sculpture, I think about creating the context for self-generating, self-diversifying feedback loops that I'm not in control of. But I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have a class where we take some time hearing about what are you making? What is the start of what you make? When is it complete? Take some time to trace where your materials come from. How many hands touch it before you? So I'll send all of these things out in a question, but I think before we jump into our reading about clay, which is very specific, there's something very beautiful about a community of artists coming together from many different ecozones. coming into a class and sharing what it is that you make. And so I wanted to today at least start by talking about what I'm making is a studio practice where I can co-create a context for catalyzing living systems into being. And so we got a chance to talk with Doug about how sound plays a role in it. And you got a chance to talk to Leigh about hugel mounds, or just scratch the surface of that and its poetic core in emulating beaver work. And we got a chance to talk to Millie before that about earth repair and how that catalyzes the work that she does with Metabolic Studio. And then Alex will come in at the end of our conversation and we'll talk about clay and the work that we're doing in a very site-based way with clay. But first, I really think we're ready to hear from you, and for you to share about that. And what is your position in the geological conversation? How might we talk with the earth, not as raw material with value, or in the case of things like sludge that beavers make and so many other non-human entities as making valueless things, but how can we see that as a co-creative strategy? What does it look like to be a collaborator with the earth or other living systems? So you don't have to bring that in, but it's if you have some thoughts on that, it would be wonderful to share that together. Any questions about that? Well, you're a wonderful class. I've been throwing a lot of pretty random stuff at you. And somehow every week you seem to just float along with it. And I really appreciate the opportunity to collage these various practices that we're cultivating at Metabolic Studio with you to find the common ground, between what we're doing as artists and how we can be of service to the other than human beings that we live with on this planet, and how that fits into the context of the art world. So we'll jump right in with that next week with your shares, and we'll spend the first half of the class with that, and bring an object or bring a picture. And I would say, we'll just sort of try and limit ourselves to like 3 to 5 minutes each for a little presentation about our work and what we're making. What's the start of what we're making? When is it complete? How does it relate to the geological conversation? And I'll send all of this out. And I look forward to hearing from you. And again, I'm available for office hours. If anybody is confused, I'll be available tomorrow. And I don't know, some of you have been using the Discord, but there's a pretty healthy conversation that's going on there. So if you're interested in more of that, we can continue any conversation on the Discord. Unfortunately, Matt has been diagnosed with COVID today, so he probably won't be available for a few days to answer questions, but I'm getting better at the Discord, so I'll be available to answer questions. And again, the main idea about the Discord is that we can continue what we start in the next 4 weeks on a Discord and share with a larger community of people who are interested in water, community, and power, the resources that we're collectively gleaning in our time together. Thank you, Leigh, for a lovely share. And I was so excited to be spending this much time thinking about beavers. They're very inspiring and just naturally make everybody smile, except for everybody hates them at the same time. I mean, it's amazing to have a foe that you kind of adore at the same time.
Can I say one thing, Lauren?
Absolutely.
Leigh, I was so pleased to see the poem by Deborah Miranda. Deborah is my childhood best friend's mother. So I actually grew up with Deborah and like watched her career, her poetry career blossom. And I love that book, Indian Cartography. All of her books are amazing. So we didn't read that today, but I encourage everyone to really sink into that poem.
We're going to read it next week.
Yes.
And hopefully Leigh will join us too, if she's probably quite curious to hear about all your practices. So you're very welcome to join us next week and listen in.
Thank you.
Douglas, always welcome as well. Thank you so much for coming back and sharing your work and your work with Marty, who I miss. We have to bring him out again. And thank you, Millie, as usual. So again, next week we will start off with all of us sharing, and then our colleague Alex Tanasi, who is our ceramicist, will come in and share a reading that he sourced about some native potters and their sourcing of clay and the techniques and practices that go with that. So have a great week, and I'll see some of you in office hours and the rest of you next week.
Thank you, Lauren. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everybody. Bye now.
Oh, and if anybody wants to join and hear this reading again with a different conversation, we'll be doing this on Tuesday, next Tuesday at 5:30 Pacific time on Metabolics Learning and Mending practice, which is similar and different to this, but it's another opportunity to read some of what we read today with a few other things. Bye.
Bye.